Hi, my name is Jon Ingold, and I'm the narrative director of Inkle Studios, with the studio that made Heaven's Vault and 80 Days, and most recently Pendragon. And I'm very excited to be delivering a keynote at the conference today. But because it's one of these weird modern online conferences, obviously this has been recorded in advance. I don't even really know when it's actually going to go live. So hello to you wherever it is and whenever you are. Which also means that I don't know what this keynote talk is called because I haven't decided yet. I thought I'd talk about what I want to talk about and then watch it back and then work out a sort of snappy title. So welcome to the process of discovery that will be what on earth am I going to say today? It's going to be okay, I think. The conference is about interactive past, right? And originally, I was going to talk about Heaven's Vault, which is our most kind of archaeologically focused game. It's about an archaeologist exploring a world called the Nebula of kind of scattered moons and uncovering the history of the civilization that lived there. And it's an unusual setting, and she's an unusual character. She's the only person in that setting who believes in history or has any understanding that history is even a thing. Everybody else believes in the predominant religion, which says that everything is status quo, everything is always the same, which is politically expedient. And our character, who's called Aaliyah, is discovering that actually, no, things have changed and become that way for a reason. It's an odd game to talk about in the context of archaeology and archaeologists, as we have done on many occasions now. I always feel a bit embarrassed about it because it's not about archaeology in the real world. It's not about uncovering anything that has ever existed. It's actually a game that is about spaceships and robots as much as it is about understanding the past or deciphering the language that's kind of one of the core mechanics of the game. But for some reason, it seems to connect with the archaeologists. And I think the reason is that our character approaches the world that she's exploring in a thoughtful way, that she makes discoveries, she puts them together, she draws conclusions, she does things that real archaeologists do. And not only does she come out with theories, but she comes out with counter theories and disproofs as much as she comes out with proofs. And I think archaeologists see that and recognize something that doesn't happen in games very much. And that got me thinking about the relationship between games and history and the games and historical work in more general terms. Because the weird thing is that while Heaven's Vault has received a lot of appreciation from archaeologists for its archaeology, it's, to my eyes or to a casual observer, like the least archaeological game that came out that year in 2019. The most archaeological game that came out that year was probably Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is an enormous, beautiful recreation of ancient Greece that you can explore around, and you can meet people, and you can climb every mountain, and you can visit every villa, and it's very much in the kind of high budget space. And in a sense, that seems like it's genuine archaeology. You're walking through a reconstructed ancient world. How is that not defeated Heaven's Vault in every conversation about archaeology, because it's so much more to do with the substance of it? And I think there is a good reason why actually it hasn't. And I think there's a reason why no one talking about Assassin's Creed Odyssey would describe it as an archaeological game, particularly. An adventure game, yes, a beautiful game, an interesting game, a classics game perhaps, but not an archaeological one. And I think it goes right back to something that I see in common across video game development, which is this, right? That video games in general strive and have been striving for many years, and look all like they're going to continue doing this, to strive for visual verisimilitude. When the creators of the worlds of Assassin's Creed set out to do their job, they look at the architecture and the geography, they put together a map, they make every mountain rise out of the ground, they give things the right shape, they probably mess around with scale, but they do that incredibly intelligently. They get the buildings right and the color and the materials right, and I should think the things that merchants sell in their shops are correct and researched and carefully laid out for you to explore and wonder at and read about. And games like Assassin's Creed sell enormously on this kind of world building. Actually, all open world games sell on their world building, whether it's real or imagined, whether it's a recreation of modern day London or London in the 1900s. That's one of the first things that we see as consumers, is look at this world that we get to be in, we get to breathe in. But ultimately, having played any of those games for a while, they end up hollow. They never survive the duration of the game as an interactive, breathing space. It's a bit like walking around the beautifully rendered science fiction world of No Man's Sky, the procedurally generated space simulator game. When you first land on your first planet, it's astonishing. The scale and breadth of the game, the ambition behind it is astonishing. In your 4th, 5th, 6th planet, as they generate different kinds of weather and different kinds of plant, are quite compelling. But after a while, that experience of discovery starts to become hollow because you've seen every pattern that you can see in that game. Well, that's what people say the problem is with No Man's Sky, that they kind of get used to the procedural element. They get used to the sort of things that it does, and then it can't surprise them anymore. But I don't think it's quite that, actually, that's really the problem. I don't think it's that the visuals ever get less stunning. They're always stunning. I think the problem is encapsulated rather neatly in the name of the conference that this talk is going to be part of. It's not pasts, it's not reconstructed pasts, it's not reconstructed science fiction universes either that we come for. It's interactive pasts, it's interactive science fiction universes. It's that sense not of wandering through somewhere, but of being there, of having a presence there. And that, I think, is where the struggle really begins for us as designers, and where the real rewards for us as players can be found. Going back to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, because it's a game I played quite a lot of, the best bits for me weren't wandering around the cities and looking at the architecture and the statues. I can't tell you whether they got repetitive or whether I saw the same features over and over or not. I genuinely don't know. But the bits I remember were talking to the humans. They were talking to the characters. I met Socrates and he was a bit of an arse, and I met Herodotus and he was very dedicated, and I enjoyed that. The points where I was literally interacting with the past were the bits that stood out for me in that game. And I think the thing that's core to understanding this, and perhaps it's obvious, is that games are held back not by the fidelity of their visuals or the amount of processing power they have or their load times or any of those sort of technical, practical features. They're held back by their verbs. As simple as that. What can the player do? In Assassin's Creed, I met Herodotus and he wanted me to kill someone who'd stolen his medical notes because that was the only verb I had. I couldn't join his medical school. I couldn't perform an operation. I couldn't decide to devote my life to the pursuit of medicine or science. Maybe if I had gone a bit further with his quest line, which I haven't, perhaps I could collect some herbs as well. That might be approaching a different kind of verb. But the bulk of the gameplay is still very much Assassin's Creed. Socrates has entered an Assassin's Creed game. Assassin's Creed hasn't gone out to find and recreate Socrates or Herodotus or any of the others. So in my view, the issue that we have when we're trying to make games that discuss or talk about or interact or just capture for a brief while that sense of history comes from two things. It comes from games trying to do too much as games simply doing the things that they're already good at. So where do we come in? Well, Inkle is definitely not going to make Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and it's not going to make anything even approaching that, or even anything approaching the scale of No Man's Sky. We're a 4-person studio at the moment, set up about 10 years ago, with the intention originally of producing narrative games. We like telling stories on computers, so that's what we thought we'd do. The funny thing is we've actually ended up telling an awful lot of historical stories or historically focused stories, though that was never our intention or our interest, and we've never really even talked about it as a strategy or a thing that we want to do. So I guess this started first when we made 80 Days, which was based on the Jules Verne book and is set in 1872, although it's an alternate history 1872 that plays around with colonialism and different ways the world could have been imagined at that time. Most recently, we released Pendragon, which is based on Arthurian legends. Definitely not history by any meaningful sense of the word, but it draws on a rich history, if only a history of literature, of British literature and British myth-making and storytelling. And in the middle, between those two games, we made Heaven's Vault, which, as I said before, is about an archaeologist. And then, on my hard drive, I have prototypes for other things we might make. And one of them is a Treasure Island game, which is about pirates, obviously. And the other is a Highwayman game. These are all historically grounded narratives. So given that we're making little text games, given that we're not even interested in the verisimilitude of the world, that we don't really build 3D complicated worlds, we don't do open exploration, why are we ending up with this historical perspective anyway? What are we trying to achieve with that? Well, across the games that we've made so far, there's been a range of styles, really quite a broad range of styles. We tend to get bored and try new things the whole time. But I think the one thing that emerges in everything that we do is that we try to be grounded. We try to make things realistic and grounded and meaningful. And I don't know what meaningful means, but we try for it anyway. Connection, I suppose. And that's where history comes in for us as storytellers, as artists, to ground things in historical truth or historical understanding helps make them real to people. And it helps to do that quickly and effectively. That's what we've discovered, I think, over time. We can create entire fantastical story worlds. We made a series called Sorcery based on a gamebook series. Perhaps that's a historical link, but I don't think it is. And that world is a lot of fun, and it gives pure adventure and pure entertainment. It's all snakes and tricksters and goblins and things. It was a blast to write, and people still enjoy playing it now. But part of me does wonder, what's the point? What's that for? Why are we making this story world? Why are we spending hours writing it? Yeah, it's fun, but perhaps to put it a different way, why that fantasy environment? I mean, if I was to make another game in the same genre as Sorcery, but not riff off this series of game books that I liked when I was a child, if I was to make one up from scratch, why would I choose this particular assortment of dragons, elves, goblins and bridges as opposed to that one? Or why not a science fiction one? Or why not, I mean, what's my reason to build any particular story world over any other story world? What's it for? Who does it serve? And those are real questions. Like, I mean, they're real questions once you've done it once. If you, the first time you do it, you just think, I wonder if I can build a world. And it turns out that with enough effort, yes, you can. So then you get the second question. I wonder if I should build a world. And that's the question I think that's interesting. So for Heaven's Vault, we did build a world. And we had a really good reason for it, which was it was a game about archaeology, and we wanted a sense of wonder and a sense of uncertainty for the player. We wanted the player to be making deductions but not know ever really if they were right, because archaeologists do that. They make deductions and they can't be sure if they're right. We've often remarked an archaeologist is like a detective who turns up really late, but not only are they a detective who turns up really late, they're also a detective who can't point a finger at the killer and say it was you and get a confession. There is no pleasing end scene like Poirot gets at the end of each of his books. The archaeologist can only say, well, I think this must have been a bathhouse, and then shrug, write a paper about it, go home and wait to be disproved. That's really the fate of all archaeological discoveries. So we needed a world that the player didn't already know. If we had made a game about archaeology but set in ancient Egypt, well, there are better ways to find out the truth of ancient Egypt than to play our computer game. And there's definitely a lot that has been decided on, well, not necessarily as being correct, but certainly is the very best guess that anyone has, and we're not going to do any better. So doing archaeology within the world of ancient Egypt is not going to elicit the feelings of archaeology, because our players are going to be discovering things that are basically commonly known already. They're not going to be at the fringes discovering the interesting unknown stuff. And perhaps that's why Assassin's Creed Odyssey doesn't get to be an archaeological game, because when we turn up in it, we recognize ancient Greece immediately. We understand spears and mercenaries and transactions and business and gold and temples. We know about all of these things. There's not very much that it can teach us, because we understand the basics, and the subtleties are really quite specific or perhaps confusing and hard to express. So we wanted something that took us back to basics, really just understanding the structure of the world, the basic outline of the history of the world, and that meant creating a world. So we did. So then up came our question. Well, okay, we're going to create a world. So why are we creating this world? And what's this world for? And why are we creating this world and not that world? And we didn't have a solid reason for every decision we took in the world building of Heaven's Vault. Or if I did, I wouldn't be able to figure out what they were. It was a long and complicated process. But the world that we ended up with, I look at it and I realized, yeah, I can see why we went the way that we went. It's a world of scattered moons linked by rivers through space that no one likes to travel on, which are slowly drying up. It's a world that's entirely about climate change, actually. It's a world that's suffering through climate change. And it's a world in the very grips of climate justice issues, which are just beginning to become the most relevant political issue of our time here in the real world. The people of the nebula are separated geographically, but those geographical locations each have their differences. There's the places that are water rich and the places that are not water rich, and the places that are connected and the places that are distant, and those directly impact the lives and the hopes and the aspirations and the future of the people who live in those spaces. And another thing that comes out of that is socioeconomic mobility. Our character starts on one moon and moves to another moon, and she doesn't really fit in here anymore and she doesn't fit in there anymore. And that idea of, as people move around, they lose connection both with where they came from and where they're going, which is, again, I think, a very relevant issue and ties into a lot of the discussions about race that you see emerging in countries like Britain, where we have a population of black people who arrived on the Windrush and from a million other places, whose parents are sort of British and sort of not British. And are they British? Well, they think they are, and most of us think they are, but not everybody thinks they are. And can you ever become truly... What does it mean to be British anyway? Because Britain is a hodgepodge country once you look a little bit further back than the last, 60 years or whatever. These are complicated issues. They're not necessarily complicated in terms of what we morally should do. It's fairly obvious what we should do. We should be nice to people. But they're complicated in terms of trying to understand the way that people think about these issues, and to try and understand why people have got these strange ideas about the British Empire or the colonial past of Britain being generally a good thing or whatever. So Heaven's Vault was a way to talk about a lot of these issues that I think are very relevant and meaningful issues to every day and to the real world, but a way to talk about them in a way that wasn't just trying to replicate the real world, but was getting people to discover their own path through it and think about it. So that's why we ended up with the world that we ended up with. But none of that, I think, is the important takeaway from Heaven's Vault for me. That's not really what the game's about. That's just how we ended up with the world that we ended up with. The interesting thing in Heaven's Vault for me is the way that it talks about stories, which brings us back to what Inkle is about, right? Inkle is a studio that tries to tell stories. And that, if that's what I do every day, if that's what I do with my grown-up adult life now that I'm 40, I must think stories are important. So are they? Well, yeah, I think they are, obviously. In fact, I think they're probably more important than reality and truth. And I think we're probably seeing that this year more than we've ever seen it before. There's a fascinating cognitive dissonance going on right now in our view of America, for instance. Around the world, I don't know how Americans feel about America right now. I feel very sorry for them most of the time. But around the world, we're rewriting our view of America. And a lot of us are finding that quite hard to do, because we've always seen America as this bastion of freedom and democracy and good sense and hope and opportunity. All these stories that we've heard about what America is like. But actually all the things that are going on in America, the terrible labor conditions, the terrible treatment of disabled and injured people, the generally terrible and cruel healthcare system, the vote rigging being operated by the major party, well, the current major party, all of this has been going on for as long as I've been alive, if not longer. It's not new. The only thing that's changed this year, or has been in the process of changing over the last couple of years, is that the narrative that we tell about America has started to change. We no longer talk about it as this place of opportunity and hope, but rather as this sort of place that's sort of tilting onto the edge of a dictatorship. And that story is a new story, and a lot of us are struggling to deal with that change, and to get that story into our heads, and to get rid of the old story that we grew up with and we trusted and we liked. That process of changing the story that we tell to ourselves about America is hard for us as human beings, but it's also incredibly important, because if we do that, and if Americans do that, if they start to look at their own country and ask questions like, why don't we have a healthcare system that respects the human body? That change in narrative is the one thing that might actually affect a change in reality. And I think most people think it probably will, and hope that it probably will, that the existing narrative is so obviously removed from reality that it can't survive much longer. So by changing the story that we tell about America, that's our first hope to actually changing America itself. The narrative that we tell about somewhere, the story that we tell about somewhere, and the story that we tell about its past and how it got to be where it was and what it was like 20 years ago and what it was like 80 years ago, has a direct impact on what we decide to do with it next. You see the same thing in Britain right now, in the other direction, I fear, that Brexit is popular because the story that we tell about Britain is this great lion of the world that owns everything and does whatever it wants. And of course, the reality is we're a small country on the edge of a much larger trading bloc, with some historical connections that help us survive, which we're currently severing and throwing away. Heaven's Vault is a game about a protagonist discovering that the stories that she has about the world that she lives are wrong, constructive, and tilted in the direction of certain powerful forces, and discovering that the new story, the truth, or closer to the truth that she discovers over time, is very difficult to sell to people, partly because they don't want to hear it because they already like the story or own the story that they know, and partly because when you're trying to tell people the truth, you know that you're not right. You know that you're not completely correct. Aaliyah can't return to Iox and explain the reality of where Iox comes from in the nebula and its actual history, because she doesn't know it for herself. Truthfully, she just knows that the current story isn't right. But it's much harder to tell people half a truth than it is for them to believe all a lie. And that, for me, is the point of Heaven's Vault. That's why we built it. That's why we made the story world, and why we made it as nebulous in the nebula as it is. And I think that's fascinating, that actually the point of it being historically focused as a game is not because history is a set of facts and a truth and a story that we need to understand and learn, but rather that history is a series of open questions and problems and inconsistencies, and it's much more about unpicking the assumptions we have from childhood than it is about coming to understand this great, glorious truth. And I think that's one of the reasons why we couldn't have made an archaeology game set in ancient Egypt, because I, as a writer, don't have any childhood assumptions about ancient Egypt that need to be unpicked. Or if I do, I don't live with them on a day-to-day basis. If someone was to turn around and tell me, your understanding of the ritual of mummification is incorrect, I would say, okay, fine. I'm not attached to that. It was something I read. It doesn't really bother me. It's not a part of my psyche. But perhaps if you're Egyptian and you make a story about the archaeology of ancient Egypt, that's completely different. I don't know. Certainly, I do know that if you make a game that deals with British history and British myth, or if I make that game, then I do interact with that, and it does affect me, which leads me on to the next game that we made, which is Pendragon. So Pendragon is a game about the myths of King Arthur, and it draws on quite a lot of the Arthurian legends, the various retellings that have existed over the last 1,500 years. The story is that you play or control King Arthur's followers as you rally to the final battle in Camlann, where King Arthur is to face his son Sir Mordred, who is taking over the crown. Camelot has fallen. It cannot be resaved. You are literally at the end of the Arthurian reign. You're at the end of the world as they know it. The world itself, though, is not properly built. Like, it isn't visually properly built. It's built out of pieces and tiles and bits of art assembled together. It looks like a cardboard game that you might buy in a box. And the way it's assembled together is quite figurative. The map resembles more like a mappa mundi than something, perhaps more like an art map from the medieval times rather than a practical map from the medieval times, if that distinction exists. I think it might. I'm not sure. It's certainly not geographically accurate as a document. Time doesn't pass properly as you move across the country. It isn't simulated. Environments often repeat. Things appear and disappear as they need to, just as the forests and castles of an Arthurian legend appear when the story asks them to and disappear into the mist as the night rides on. We very rarely see the same castle twice in Mallory because it doesn't matter. So what's Pendragon really about, if it's not actually about a recreation of the gritty reality of King Arthur as a Dark Age warrior lord? If it's not about exactly what were the armours like and how did they ride their horses and did they have Norman helmets? Or if it's not about verisimilitude, what is Pendragon about? What's it for? Why do we do it? Why do I claim that it's historical? Well, for me, it's a game about protest in the face of overwhelming opposition. Oh, look, it's political again. It's about fighting oppression and continuing to fight oppression even when the battle has already been lost. In the end of the game, Arthur falls, Camelot falls. Everything is lost. The journey, in a sense, is pointless. The fight is pointless. You can't win it. Except, and this goes back to Arthurian myth, Arthur falls and Camelot falls, but the idea of Camelot does not fall. The idea of a king that rules in a just fashion, the idea of a council of wise people talking to solve problems, the idea that strength and the state should exist to protect the weak rather than to protect the interests of the strong, those ideas survive. They did survive, in fact. They're narratives about a past that never even existed. It didn't, right? Surely it didn't. I don't think anyone really believes that it did. But those narratives have shaped our reality. Our governments here across Europe have, over the centuries, moved closer and closer to this model of a round table. We see that we see that most powerfully. I see that most powerfully when I look at the EU on television, and there is literally this round chamber of voices talking together. This is a round table, and I think one of the current idiocy of the UK's position of what we're doing with the EU right now is actually in the long term very similar, I think, in that we will fall out of the round table, but it's only going to consolidate the strength of that idea of a European Council in the minds of my generation and my children's generation. We're going to grow up, they're going to grow up to come and see the EU as this shining example of what government ought to be like, because we tried it and we lost it, and we can see that we want it back. Despite the success of our current Prime Minister, that is where that story goes, and it's where Arthur's story goes too. So when we're playing Pendragon, what we're asking people to do is to engage with the process, not of winning, not of turning the tide of battle, not of some last minute save, but rather of ensuring that what matters survives into the future in the form of a story, of creating the most powerful story, or the most affecting story, or the most honourable story that has a hope of affecting future generations, that has this chance of becoming something that we can send forward to the future in a way that we can't send our bodies, and we can't send our stuff very well, and we can't send our laws, but we can send ideas forward. And that's what the characters in Pendragon are doing. They're not real. There's no historical truth here. It's not archaeological in that sense, but it's definitely concerned with the past and the relationship of the past to the future through the stories that get told about the past. And they mean something to me because I'm British, but I imagine if you're Chinese, Japanese, African, that you might well play Pendragon and say, this doesn't mean anything to me. I don't get anything from this. I have no connection to it. Perhaps they might look at it and say, that reminds me of this story from my culture, from my childhood, from my background that I do relate to. Perhaps not. I don't know. I'd love to find out. Had Pendragon been set on Mars, which, we could have done, and it didn't need to be King Arthur. It could have been an astronaut called John Smith fighting his way across Mars. That's been done. All of that strength, all of that compelling metaphorical layer, all of that heart would have been lost completely. As a storyteller, as someone who wants to tell stories, as someone who wants to tell the world what they're supposed to think, because that's what storytellers do, I'm leveraging the past and the myth for my purpose. I'm not reflecting it or representing it. I'm not necessarily even being appropriate with it or kind with it. I may be, but then again, I may not be. But what I am doing is I'm using it to give my narrative power. I'm using it to create narratives that I feel are grounded and strong and compelling and authoritative, in a hope that I can very gently steer reality, that I can give my story to the people who play the game and have them change the way they think about reality. Just a little bit, even if they start to question the stories they've heard, or they start to understand that what we do now might affect things in the future in unexpected ways. Actually, that's propaganda. That's the same tool that the far right is using, only as a left-wing, compassionate storyteller, I do it through the medium of art, discovery and growth, rather than through the language of hatred and division. That's the fundamental difference, I think, between the arts approach and the right-wing approach, is that one of them is a nurturing process and the other one is a surgical one. But in the same way that in film, Marvel movies are entirely entertaining, absolutely do not attempt to steer reality with their messages whatsoever, and also in the way that Assassin's Creed doesn't either. It produces a wonderful verisimilitude, realistic looking, very realistic looking ancient Greece to walk around, but it's not attempting to tell us anything we should take back into reality to change how we act in reality. Or maybe it does a bit, and maybe I haven't noticed what it's doing, but I don't think it does. So for me, the idea of playing in a past world, of exploring a past world virtually created, is something of a passing fancy, actually. I will buy Assassin's Creed Valhalla when it comes out, and I will look forward to exploring their rendering of Dark Age Britain, a setting that is the same as Pendragon's, but I'm sure will be very different. And I'm sure I will enjoy it for a good while. It'll certainly be very beautiful. But that purely visual indulgence, for me at least, I'm not a hugely visual person, will fade, and then it will be up to the characters and the meaning of what they're doing in the world to catch me. And perhaps it will and keep me compelled, and perhaps it won't. Certainly it will have an uphill battle. Games that lean on their characters struggle hard because of the way that games work. I mean, I tend to come away from Assassin's Creed games with a huge sense of lost opportunity. That there was a beautiful world here, and there was something that could have been done, which in itself is quite interesting. I don't have that feeling when I come away from Horizon Zero Dawn, even though I leave both games for the same mechanical reason, that I've done all the mechanics they have. I'm tired of the combat. The pickups no longer seem intriguing. I feel like I've seen everything there is to see. But in one game, I'm happy to leave the world unfinished, and in the other I always feel like, but what is it that they should have done to keep me there? Because I should have wanted to be there. I should have wanted to be in ancient Greece. Perhaps that's just me being middle class and feeling that I need to be educated the whole time. I'm not sure. A lot of people say, when they talk about games, when they defend games, when people say, games are a waste of time, well, okay, a lot of games are a waste of time, and that's not actually a bad thing. That's perfectly fine. Tetris is a waste of time. 2048 is a waste of time, but it's perfectly entertaining. But one thing that people say about the games which are not intended to be a waste of time is that games can give us more. They can give us more than film can give us. They can give us more than books can give us. Because of this interactivity, they can give us more. And it's a platitude, obviously. But it always, to me, raises a question, which is more what? What is it that games ought to be or could be giving us more on? They definitely give us more all the time. There's more detail. There's more physics on minor objects. There's more lighting effects. Redemption 2 has more things in the musculature structure of its horses than any game has ever made before. There's certainly more, but that's not what I actually want. I don't know if it's what anybody wants. It's easy to sell, I suppose. What I want is more meaning. I want more understanding. I want more connection with whatever is behind the game. And games are really bad at connection. They're great at engagement and they're great at compulsion, but that's not connection. And that's not an accident. It's because connection is a human thing, and games, above all, are really, really bad at human things, at the human component and the human element. Human characters in games are almost always robots. They speak and they talk and they stand like robots, quite often like this, like they're on a permanent Zoom call with the player. Games are about learning systems, and if there's any empathy involved, usually that's just a system. In games, romance is a verb, to romance someone, which sounds pretty awful, to be honest. Recently, very recently, CD Projekt Red announced a 4-week delay to their upcoming Cyberpunk game, and received death threats in return. And their reply was, don't say these things to us. We're people too. And that really struck me, because they're working in an art form that has tried its absolute damnedest over the last 4 decades to keep all the humanity out as much as possible and as far away as possible, and keep everything systematic and objective and out of 10 and about frame rates and anything that is not human and denies that connection. To be fair to CD Projekt Red, who are a great studio, they don't do that. They refuse to try and do that. Well, I have no idea what Cyberpunk will be like, but certainly in their previous games, humanity is at the forefront of what they try to do. The Witcher 3, which is considered to be one of the best games of the last decade, and certainly was very bloody good, is a game about exploring a fantasy world full of monsters. But that's not what its compulsion is. It's imbued with a sense of history and a sense of reality and a sense of folklore, and its stories are all about human error and morality and human failings and human needs. It's a very human game, actually. And that's where its weight comes from. It comes from that grounding in the real world, that sense of the mixture of the past and the present, the lessons that it teaches us about today, and also the ideas that it gives us about what life might have been like in, I think it's Poland, in 1400. It's a game about monsters, but it's very much a game about people. So, Inkle is a 4-person studio. We're somewhat lesser than CD Projekt Red, and we make things that we think are worth making, and we make things that we enjoy making, and we hope that they connect with the people who play them. And we tend to find that some people have no idea what it is we're doing with any given game, and some people find them very compelling, and that's art, I suppose. And despite what I said earlier about all the games and the projects that we've made, I don't think what we do is historically motivated, and I don't think we exist to answer historical questions or to make historical games or to talk about history particularly. I don't think we exist to educate or inform. I don't even think we're necessarily very good at educating or informing. Our commitment to research is somewhat less than that of the artists who make Assassin's Creed. But I think what we try to do, what Inkle tries to do, what keeps me excited about the work that I do, is that we try to make games that are about humans and are for humans. And everything else is secondary to that. And everything else is a tool to help us do that. And the technology is a tool if it lets us create an emotional connection, or lets us create a human connection from the writers of the game, from the makers of the game, to the person playing the game. Some kind of understanding, something that is more than the sum of the mechanics and the button presses and the responses and the adrenaline shocks and whatever else a game might give you. Something that is more persistent than that. My proudest moments with Heaven's Vault are when I hear people talking about the game when they're not playing it to each other and saying, oh, I had this idea about, or I felt like this character, maybe that some element of that game or that world has entered people's heads in a way that they want to speculate about, and they want to deepen their understanding of outside of what the buttons in the game will let you do. There's more to the world than what the game supplies. The game is a mechanism to deliver the ideas of the world and the characters of the world and the themes of the world from our heads into your heads, if you're willing to be host to them. And in that context, leveraging the past, writing about the past, exploring our ways of thinking about the past is vital, because the past is incredibly significant to human beings, but it is just another tool to go alongside all the other tools. So for me, I think, well, Heaven's Vault is something of an extended essay on archaeology, and it touches on some of the issues the archaeologists face in their work. And Pendragon is something of an essay on mythology and storytelling and the way we view ourselves as a nation, the way the British view ourselves as a nation. I think above all, they're games about people, about the people within the systems trying to reach out and connect with each other. So I hope that if you've played either of those games, if you played any of our games, that some of that connection has happened. And I hope listening to this talk that some connection has happened from me to you. I apologise profusely for not having made a PowerPoint for you to look at. I hope that wasn't too much of a shock. So enjoy the rest of the conference. I hope I gave you something interesting to think about, and I think I'm going to be around to answer questions about this talk, but I don't know, because I'm in the past and you're in the present. So enjoy. I hope things are sunny there. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Well, that certainly gave us something to think about. Let me have a little look at. We are in fact in the present, and Jon Ingold is also with us in the present, so that's really wonderful. I'm gonna let him into our chat room, and if you have any questions, start piling them up in the chat, please. Hi, Jon. Wait a minute. There we go. Hi, Jon. Just a moment where I get all the technical stuff in order. There we go. Yes, the technical stuff is in order. Not so sunny on your side, I see at the moment in the present.
No, it's definitely thinking about being winter. A pretty winter's day, but nonetheless very much winter.
Same here across the channel. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. I don't know if you've been following the Twitch chat while this video was running, but uh, people were more or less in awe of following along with the thought. There was no PowerPoint needed for that at all.
I wish I had been there. Actually, I must admit I think you're on a European time zone, and it threw me, or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, I suddenly realised, oh, I need to be there now.
No,
so I would love to have heard what people's reactions were, but maybe somebody can tell me now.
Absolutely, no, for sure. I think all of us really enjoyed the particular comparisons you drew with Assassin's Creed and the games that you were making, or at least the aims of the games that you were making. And so one of the things that I would want to ask first. Now it's been a little while since you recorded this, but have you thought of a title yet?
Oh yes, I have. I think it should be called Playing with History.
Playing with history. Very good. I think that's apt. There were a couple of other titles passing by. I think as well in the chat, basically quoting from some of the one-liners that we tried to make games about humans by humans. That would also have been a very good title.
Yeah, but I feel that's a punchline that needs to be there at the end, not up front.
That is true. That is always my weakness when it comes to presentations. I always have the punchline in the beginning. So
that's academia, though, isn't it? Like you have to put the punchline up front. Those are the rules.
I guess maybe that's a big difference between making games and narratives and academia. Yes, for sure.
Well, I think that might be true. Actually, I think storytellers are supposed to hide what the story is about, and academics are supposed to really not hide whatever they're talking.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's at least what we've been talking about. We've been taught in the first year. So, Jon, just while other people are gathering their thoughts and some questions. I got the distinct impression, to put it mildly, that your games or your aims in game making are also very much, I mean, political is a bit of an overused word, but you were talking about making an impact in the world. Is that just not necessarily connected to the past, but do you think that any interesting narrative has to set out to make some sort of impact in the world, or is there also something that story for the story?
So I think that this is something that for me is changing as I change as a human being, right? When I was younger, I was definitely interested in stories that were about ideas. I liked Asimov. I liked, Chris Nolan movies. I liked things that were clever or felt different or felt unusual. And I enjoyed figuring them out. I guess it's like detective stories. I used to read a lot of detective stories, and I really enjoyed figuring them out. And then at some point, after you figured out your 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th puzzle box of a story, or had your like 8th great emotional narrative, you start to think, well, is this all that a story can do? And I think I was probably in my late 20s when it finally dawned on me that no, that's not all that a story can do.
Sure.
And that one of the things that I love about writing in whatever media you're writing is that you can deliver things which impact someone in the short term, like a good joke or a one-liner or a nice character. And you can deliver things that impact people in the medium term, like a good story. And you can deliver things which impact people in the long term, which make them fundamentally change the way they think about something. And you can do all three of those things at the same time. You have to be incredibly good at writing to do that, but we should all be aiming to be better than we are. Like that's the whole point of doing art, and that's the whole point of practicing and getting better at things. So I think as I get older, I've naturally started to gravitate towards, when I'm halfway through writing something, stopping and saying, yeah, but what's this about? Like, what am I actually trying to say here? And that question is getting more and more crystallized. So like when we wrote 80 Days, I remember stopping halfway through and saying, what's this about? Oh, it's about haste, and it's about hurrying, and it's about missing the world because you're too busy running through it. And if I was to write that now, or co-write that now, 6 years later, I would think, that is way too woolly for what is a story about. Like, it's too vague, it's too kind of like back of the corncoflakes packet, like it's not punchy enough. And I think actually 80 Days was saved by the fact that Meg Giant, who did the bulk of the writing, had a much more coherent and consistent idea of what that game was about, and she put that in there and saved my ass on that project.
Well, having played and very much enjoyed 80 Days, I can definitely also see that narrative theme almost becomes the central mechanic, right? That's still definitely in there, I would say.
Well, I think that's part of the process of figuring out what's a game about, is looking holistically. You're looking at the narrative, you're looking at the characters, you're looking at the mechanics and saying, what are all of these things trying together to say? So, in Heaven's Vault, we had a much more mature approach to that, I think, in that looking at the world, the characters, the world building and its kind of socioeconomics, but also the mechanic of translation. It's all about this idea of how do we understand the society that we're in, and how do we express our understanding, and how does that change the society itself, and that feedback loop. And there isn't really anything in the game that isn't about that, apart from the bit where you're sailing along rivers just because we thought they were pretty.
And they are, yes, absolutely. Some questions from the chat, in particular one that I think would also I'm gonna steer a little bit. Sorry, Chilla's asking this question, but I'm gonna steer it a little bit, because one of the things that was very interesting to me in your talk was in one of the comparisons you did with Assassin's Creed is, Assassin's Creed has more or less a research department alongside other creative departments. It wasn't entirely sure to me whether you would see that as a blessing for your studio itself, or as something that maybe if you could invest in it, you would. But and leading into that, in Chilla's question, more generally, what is your process in the studio for developing a new game and story? So it's a two-part question here.
Okay, so to talk about research first, I think the structure of the way that we approach projects is so completely different that they require different solutions. So, for something like Assassin's Creed, when they start a project, they must have multiple teams working from day one, producing absolutely final content. The map maker needs to generate the map, and they need to do it fast so the artist can generate the art, but the art needs to know what to build and blah, 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 blah. And all the narrative people need to know what all of that stuff is. So you absolutely need a robust research team that's distributing information to everyone on the project, and they have to be absolutely inarguable. You cannot afford to have an environment artist saying, well, I think you'll find in 563 AD the Romans didn't use this kind of bronze. You have to have a power structure, because it's such an enormous undertaking. So they do it the way they have to, and I think you get the benefits of a very well researched world, and you get the cost of a world which is full of research that doesn't necessarily make any difference to anyone. Like whether the jugs in Assassin's Creed look correct or not, nobody knows or cares. And
there's a tiny segment of the population that are those people that excavate those. But absolutely, yes.
Nobody knows. Okay. But I mean, it's this slightly bizarre commitment to making it accurate when most of the audience isn't even aware whether that's been done or not. I certainly am. For us, for me, because I tend to do most of the writing independently, or at least if not independently with, there's two of us, if on some projects, the research is a core part of working out what the story is and what the characters and what the world is. Like, you can't design a story and then go and research it to find out whether your story makes sense. But also, if you do nothing but research, you won't have any ideas for what the hell your story is supposed to be about. So what I tend to do is start with an impression of what the game is going to be like, or what it's going to be about, sort of a vague sense drawn from what I happen to know. And then I'll go away and research bits of that, and those bits will inform my idea and say, okay, well, this bit was implausible, but this bit actually is really interesting. Or so I recently wrote a game called Over the Alps with a lady called Catherine Nile, which is a Second World War game set in Switzerland. I've never been to Switzerland. We did a bunch of research on Switzerland at the same time as starting to write the narrative. And it was this wonderful process. We had no time, where Catherine would say, I found a cow festival where they dress cows up with flowers. And I'd be like, right, I found a space in the narrative for a cow festival. So, and we were constantly wiring the two things together, but it was very much in parallel. So, the story prompts the research and the research prompts the story. And that to me feels like a great process, because the story grows in the way that it wants to grow, but without losing its connection and its kind of coupling to the real world.
Yeah.
So I guess that's our process. Oh, it's organic, really. I mean, we do whatever seems sensible.
No, and in that sense, I think there's definite connections there to lots of researchers and how they approach research themselves. It can also be very, very organic, right? That's something I recognize from my own research process in finding the stories there. That halfway doing a PowerPoint presentation, a much smaller undertaking than making a game, but definitely always under time pressure. You find that the thing starts to be about something else, or has this particular tidbit inserted that you just came across. So I think there's definitely some connections there, and maybe you're doing more research in that sense than you're thinking, or maybe we're as academics are simply playing more or developing more than we're thinking. So a question from the chat. Do you think it's possible to make a story simply be fun in the same way that you said a game can simply be a waste of time, yet still fun like Tetris? Is there such a thing as a Tetris story? That's a very interesting.
Yeah, I think so. One of my favorite novels is Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, which is not a very good representation of 1930s Egyptology. It's not a very good representation of human beings and their relationships, but it's a beautifully sketched detective story with a great twist. It's very enjoyable to read. I think the world is full of purely fun stories. They often have one or two little hooks to kind of bring you in, but the majority of what gets published and read is accessible fiction. I think that's fair. I don't think that's insulting anyone to call it that. And that's geared very much towards being anyone can get into it, anyone can enjoy it, anyone can get something out of it, and anyone can forget about it afterwards. And yeah, I think that's absolutely there, and it's very prevalent. In fact, I find it rather frustrating, in fact, trying to find something which isn't sort of merely fun when I'm looking for things to read, because quite often I'll look at something and think, oh, that looks interesting, and then it turns out that no, it isn't.
Yeah, sure.
because I do feel for myself that I've read so much stuff that I just thought was fun that these days I need something more to hold my attention, because it's like when you're watching a film. When I get to my wife and I will sit down to watch a film in the evening, and you watch the first hour and a half, and then you get to the third act, which is where everything goes wrong, and then it gets fixed at the end. And we sort of just stop because we've seen third acts. We don't need to see any more. Like we go, yeah, it's all going to go wrong, and then it'll be fine. We've seen the setup, which was the interesting bit. So we watch the first hour and a half of films all the time, which is so rude. But
well, I mean, this once again is also, I think, an analogy to Assassin's Creed games or games like that, right?
Well,
for all the hard work that goes into games across the spectrum of the sort of the rhythm of the narrative, many people simply don't get to the endings of them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And in that sense, I think your games are always particularly good at propelling the player towards the ending. And in that sense, I think Pendragon is a real good example of that, right? Which the ending comes sudden almost, and then there's stories after that. So almost some sort of cyclical storytelling, right? That's going on in Pendragon. Very much, of course, part of the Arthurian cycle itself. Is that something that you also can sort of see? Would that be possible with a even more historical, narratively grounded game? You think? This cyclicality of things.
I am fascinated by it as a concept, actually. I think there are kind of two things that feed into it, but they're design thoughts, really. And the first is narrative games are really haunted by the problem of failure, of what do you do with a player that fails a challenge or fails to spot something or fails to figure something out. What do you do with a detective story where the detective just doesn't solve the crime, or an action story where the hero falls off a ledge and dies? Like, both of those things cannot be allowed by the narrative. And if you just reset the player, then the narrative just has to go on hold until everybody catches up, which is sort of rubbish. So I've gotten really interested in this idea of how can you fail forwards? How can you take every player failure and design the game in such a way that that failure becomes a key narrative beat rather than becoming a narrative mistake? And you can see that in 80 Days. You can see that in Heaven's Vault. You can see that in Pendragon. It's the same idea of making sure that there is no concept of hard failure. There's only concept of narrative fails. And we play with that in different ways. So for 80 days, obviously it's there in how long does your journey take? And that was a very simple solution. In Heaven's Vault, the whole plot constructs itself depending on what happens to you and what you discover and what you don't. And for us, Heaven's Vault wasn't really intended to be a replayable game. We thought people would play through, get to the end, and then go, oh, I get it. But if they wanted to replay it, then they can, and they'd be surprised. We find that actually most people who do finish the game then replay the game straight away because they have a sense that they must have missed something. Yeah. And they did because of the way that it builds itself. For Pendragon, though, I really wanted to push that a lot further. And I wanted to push really hard against that idea that the ending of a game is somehow a really important, unique thing. So when people talk about narrative games, right, they say, oh, how many endings has this game got? Could you get this ending? And could you get that ending? And, oh, in a lot of cases, I never even got the ending because it was 25 hours away and I couldn't face it. And so we really wanted to say, well, look, when you play a game of chess, when you play a game of blackjack or poker, the idea of not reaching the end of the game is ridiculous. Like, nobody puts a game down in the middle, a board game down in the middle and goes, oh, well, that's fine, we've had enough. That's a bizarre idea. Why do computer games not only allow that, but it's so common? So we thought, well, okay, let's see if we can make a game where the ending is not this bizarre goal that kind of sits above everything, but it's just part of the process. It's just in the same way that the end of a game of chess is part of the process of playing chess. Chess players don't play one game and then go, oh, I've done chess now.
That'd be interesting, right?
Well, I think they'll be very bad at it. But, and that really was the kind of kernel idea that led to this. And of course, and then there was a point where we sat back and we thought, well, what does that mean? Oh, we're talking about song cycles and story cycles. Right, yeah, no, this works. And that all kind of came together. And that idea of using endings as just a natural beat in the process of telling and retelling a story felt really good. And like, I can't wait to play with that idea in the next game or whatever we do next, because I think it's something that games really have to tackle head on, actually. Yeah. And larger AAA games just they can't do anything about it. Assassin's Creed can't have an interesting approach to ending states because you're in a combat, you die or you don't die, and then you get this bizarre situation where people stop playing a game because it gets too hard, even though they're not enjoying the combat because they just want to see the story. And so they put in an easy mode, which is too easy, but then the combat's kind of pointless. And it's just, what are you making here? This just big old stirred pot of stuff. Yeah. And yeah, we have the liberty as a small studio to do something a bit more targeted. I think there was a question that I didn't answer there, but
I'll try and answer it for you in the sense that so the cyclicality and the idea of history then, because of course stories can be cyclical, right. And I think one recent game that I've also really enjoyed, and I think it's not coincidental that it also has to do with myth and legend, just like Pendragon, is Hades. I don't know if you've already played it, but it's, I think, an absolutely wonderful example of how a roguelike, this kind of gritty game mechanic, ends up being this very wonderful cyclical narrative as well. But one of the things, of course, that we tend to think of in when it comes to history is we don't really like to think about the failing states of history so much, right? Quite literally, the failed states of history, because they don't seem that interesting to us to sort of play through. There's a couple of games that do stuff like that. For example, I don't know if you play those or if you're familiar with them, but the Paradox interactive games, in which you are not necessarily working towards an end state, but you're, one person within a dynasty, and the dynasty, waxes and wanes and etc. So there's examples of that within like hardcore historical games. But I mean, other games are very much always powering on towards that end state, right? The Sid Meier Civilization type of games, or the Assassin's Creed games. So definitely there's something possible there, but it's not happening in the AAA status. So I think we're going to end with this question, but another question from the chat about the ambiguity of Heaven's Vault, which is, for Ludo History, the question asking one of the very favorite things about the game. How did you balance this ambiguity with the proposed explanations we read while sailing across the river? In other words, was there anything specific you did to balance imaginative interpretation and also guiding people to more plausible expectations?
So the answer is not on a robust and rigid level, no. But the way that Aaliyah decides and deduces things
as she explores the game is essentially that she collects information and over here, and she collects information over here, and then the script will say, well, if she knows this and she knows this, but she doesn't know that, and it's a reasonable deduction, then let's have her say, oh, I've had an idea. That's how the idea process works. Only these chains of knowledge that she picks up might be wrong. She might have a theory that a particular location is a temple when it's actually, I don't know, a bus stop or whatever, and then she'll spin off.
Has happened to archaeologists as well.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So, but one thing that we were really aware of as we built it was that building these chains of knowledge gets really complicated in terms of how the script works. It gets very fussy and very messy, and it's not completely free to do. So there are more chains of conversation about the truth than there are conversations about things which are not actually the truth. And the ones that are about things which are wrong tend to be shorter and simpler and often end in a contradiction, just because otherwise my head would have come off as a writer. So what happens in practice is that you can't tell whether you're exploring something which is true or not true, but there's a kind of natural gravitational pull towards things which are accurate over things which aren't accurate. But it's not perfect and it's not robust. And we've just finished the Switch port. We're currently kind of getting it through the final processes. And so I played a game of Heaven's Vault myself. I haven't actually really sat down and played it beginning to end as a player ever before because I was too close to the script. But I played it, and I ended up at the end with this kind of nice hodgepodge of like things which I knew for a fact were true, and then a bunch of things that I just clicked along the way because I thought I would. Nice. And they've never quite been disproved, and they hung around there as just sort of bad evidence souring the good evidence. And I think that's exactly what we wanted to achieve, really, was just this sense that you end up with a sort of 90% reconstruction and then a lot of dodgy bits that you can't necessarily figure out are dodgy. And I like that because that was something we really wanted to aim for. We really wanted the timeline to be kind of 80% true by the end of the game and maybe contain a couple of direct contradictions. And I think that's really helped the game to survive in people's imaginations. Like we have a Discord server where people are still, sort of unpicking the plot and comparing theories and coming up with ideas. And, if we had locked that down, if we'd just said, look, it's like this, then all of that magic goes away. And I think it was a balancing act. It was forced on us by the way that the script is written, but I think it worked out quite well, actually. It's one of the things I'm most proud of in the game, I think, actually, is the amount you can get wrong and never know that you've got it wrong, which is a weird thing for a game to do.
Yeah. But not for archaeologists to do. So,
no, right, exactly. So, yeah. That reminds me, do I have time to tell an anecdote? I've got
absolutely.
Right, so, I have various connections to academia, but one of the connections is my father's an academic, and he had a postgraduate student who later ended up either running a department in the British Museum or married to someone who ran a department in the British Museum. I can't remember which. Anyway, he took us at one point to an early opening of an exhibition. And in the exhibition in the British Museum, very prestigious museum, obviously, there was a coat made of feathers. It's from somewhere or other. It was quite an eclectic exhibition. And the card, the thing that tells you what it is, said, coat made of feathers, built such place. This coat would have granted the wearer magical protection from the outside world and would have been put on, when you leave your house in order to prevent the world from attacking you and to keep you safe even while you were outside of your house. And my friend turned to me and said, so in short, it's a coat. Because that's what coats do. Yes. That's what they're for. And it's not that this culture built a strange magical coat out of feathers. It's that we don't really understand what a coat is. We think of a coat as this solution to the problem of rain, but it's not. You put a coat on because you want to wrap up in something and you want something to keep you safe. Yeah. And actually the understanding of the magic coat is actually much closer to reality than the understanding of the coat as sold to you by John Lewis or the North Face or wherever you buy your coats from. And I really like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in that sense, this has been said by various archaeologists as well, heritage scholars in particular, there's this idea of, also with the past, there's this sense of enchantment as well, right? And I think that's also being brought out very nicely by the games that you play. At least that's what I feel when I play them. So in that sense, to me, there's so many intersections between the type of things that archaeologists, historians, and all sorts of other people primarily interested in the past do, and the games that your studios are interested in making. So thank you so much for taking the time to, first of all, talk us through this whole process of your engagement with the past and with storytelling in games, and then afterwards taking the time to chat with me. Wonderful. I do definitely hope to see you around, either maybe around in the chat or somewhere, or otherwise at some other point, an archaeology conference, at a game conference, who knows. Anyway, for now, I definitely wish you all the very best, and stay happy, and of course also stay healthy, you and yours.
You too. Thank you very much. Lovely talking to you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.